Tonight, we are going to explore one of the strangest misconceptions in American history, a night remembered with fireworks. That had no fireworks, a document known around the world, whose most important working copy disappeared forever. A date celebrated by hundreds of millions of people every year. That wasn't even the date John Adams thought anyone would remember. So settle in, let your body grow heavy, and let's return to Philadelphia. Close your eyes, take a slow breath in, and let it go. I want you to picture July the 4th. You already have an image in your mind, don't you? Fireworks climbing into a dark summer sky. Crowds on lawns and rooftops, faces tilted upward, the smell of gunpowder and grilled food drifting together on the warm night air, laughter, music, children running barefoot through the grass. It is a picture so familiar it almost feels like memory. But I want to take you somewhere else tonight. I want to take you to the real July the 4th. Not the one that lives in paintings and parades, the one that actually happened. On the night of July the 4th, 1776, there were no fireworks over Philadelphia. There was no parade, no ceremony, no crowds singing in the streets. There was only a warm summer evening and a small group of exhausted, frightened men, and the slow scratch of a quill pen moving across paper. Tonight, we are going to walk through that evening together. We are going to wander the quiet streets of colonial Philadelphia. We are going to peer through candlelit windows. We are going to sit with the men who changed history in the moments before they knew they had changed anything at all. And as we walk, I want you to let your body grow heavy. Your shoulders soft, your hands still, your breath slow and deep and easy. The year is 1776. The night is warm, and the city of Philadelphia is almost entirely asleep. Philadelphia, in the summer of 1776, was the largest city in colonial America. It held something close to 30,000 souls, merchants and ministers, blacksmiths and bakers, servants and students and sailors waiting on the docks for tide and weather to shift in their favor. It was a city of narrow streets and red brick buildings, of church steeples rising above the rooftops, of markets that opened before dawn and closed with the light. And on a warm evening in early July, it smelled remarkable. Not remarkable in a pleasant way, necessarily. Remarkable in the way that a living city always smells. Complex, layered, real. This was not the sanitized, managed air of the modern world. This was something much richer and much rawer than that. The tanneries along the waterfront contributed first. Tanning was the process of turning animal hides into leather, and it involved soaking those hides in large vats of liquid made from tree bark and animal waste. It was essential work. Leather was needed for shoes, for harnesses, for book bindings, for dozens of things a city could not do without, but it produced a smell that settled over the neighborhoods near the river and refused to leave. Those who lived nearby stopped noticing it after a while. Visitors always noticed immediately. Underneath that, if you were upwind of the tanneries, came something better, the bakeries. Philadelphia had many of them, and in July the bakers rose before 3 in the morning to fire their ovens before the worst of the heat set in. By the time evening arrived, the ovens had been cold for hours, but the smell of bread, that warm, yeasty, deeply comforting smell still lingered in the alleyways around the shops, caught in the wood and the brick, holding on into the night. And then, everywhere, always, the horses. A city of 30,000 people in 1776 ran almost entirely on horses. They pulled the carts that moved goods from the docks to the warehouses. They carried the coaches of wealthier residents along the main streets. They stood in livery stables throughout the city, dozens of them in some blocks, and what horses produce in quantity continuously, regardless of what is historically significant about the day, was everywhere underfoot and, in the July heat, very much in the air. And behind everything else, threading through all the other smells like a low note held beneath a melody, came the river. The Delaware, wide and dark, carrying its particular combination of mud and salt and the smell of things that had travelled a long way to be here. When the tide was low, the river smell was stronger. In the summer heat, it rose toward the city and mixed with everything else and became simply the smell of Philadelphia. Impossible to separate out, impossible to imagine the place without. This was the air that the delegates to the Continental Congress breathed, every day, all summer. This was the city that surrounded them while they argued and deliberated and tried to decide what a nation was and whether they had the right to make one. But on the evening of the 4th of July, most of the people breathing that air were not thinking about nations at all. They were thinking about dinner. An ordinary Philadelphia family on a July evening in 1776 would have eaten simply. Elaborate meals were for midday, when the main business of the day was either underway or just finished. The evening meal, supper, as it was called, was lighter. Bread certainly, butter if the household could afford it, cheese perhaps, or cold meat left from the afternoon. In summer, whatever vegetables were in season, string beans, early corn, cucumbers from a kitchen garden, wealthier households might have had something more. A cold chicken. A meat pie made that morning and allowed to cool through the heat of the day. A glass of cider or small beer with a low alcohol content that was considered safer to drink than water because no one yet understood why water sometimes made people sick, only that it sometimes did. The meal would have been eaten at a wooden table by the light of whatever windows were still bright with the last of the evening sky, or by the light of a tallow candle, not beeswax, which was expensive, but tallow made from rendered animal fat, which smelled faintly when it burned and dripped more readily, but was what most people could afford. And then the question that every household in Philadelphia faced in July, the heat. There was no way in 1776 to make a room cooler than the air outside it. There was no ice to speak of in July. Whatever had been cut from ponds in January and stored in underground ice houses had mostly been used up by midsummer. There were no fans, except the kind you held in your hand. No mechanical relief of any kind. What people did was manage the heat as best they could. During the day, shutters were closed on the sunny side of the house to keep direct sunlight from heating the rooms further. Windows on the shaded side might be left open to catch whatever movement of air there was. Cooking was done as early in the morning as possible to let the kitchen cool before the worst of the afternoon arrived. Heavy work was done at dawn. By mid-afternoon, the city moved more slowly. People sat in doorways where there might be a cross breeze. Wealthy households had gardens where trees provided shade, and the ground stayed cooler than the street. In the evenings, the shutters on the sunny side could finally be opened, And sometimes, if the day had been dry and a breeze came off the river, there was genuine relief as the air moved through the house and the stone walls began to release the heat they had absorbed through the long afternoon. Sometimes, not always. July in Philadelphia could be stubborn about its heat. The children were put to bed in whatever was coolest, which was often the floor, or a trundle bed pulled away from the wall to catch more air. Parents sat up a while longer, too warm to sleep, talking quietly, or simply sitting in the dark with their thoughts. And here is something that most people have never considered. A farmer living just a few hundred miles from Philadelphia, in the hill country of Virginia, or the forests of western Pennsylvania, would wake up on the 5th of July with absolutely no idea that a new nation had been declared. Not because they were indifferent, but because there was no newspaper delivered to their door, no signal to their pocket, no voice from a box on the wall. Information in 1776 travelled at the speed of a horse. A horse covering 30 miles a day through summer roads meant that many Americans would not hear the news for days. Some, in the more remote corners of the colonies, would not learn of independence for weeks. A nation had been born, and most of its people did not yet know they were citizens of it. Now, let the city settle into evening around you. The last of the light has faded from the western sky. The air is a little cooler than it was, though not by much. The lanterns have come on one by one along the main streets. Oil lanterns on iron hooks, small and wavering, throwing circles of uncertain orange light onto the cobblestones below. The cobblestones themselves are still warm from the day. You can feel the heat of them through the soles of your shoes if you go out walking. The brick walls of the buildings hold their warmth long after sundown, radiating it slowly back into the air of the narrow streets. Listen to the sounds of the city as it moves toward night. A cart horse clops slowly past, its driver, half asleep on the bench, reins loose in his hands. The animal knows the route. It does not need to be guided home. The sound of its hooves on the stone, hollow, rhythmic, gradually fading, is one of the most familiar sounds of a colonial city after dark. From somewhere not far away comes the sound of a door being pulled shut, the iron latch dropping into place with a quiet clank. A shutter bangs in a momentary breeze and someone leans out to pull it more firmly closed. A dog, somewhere down an alleyway, barks twice at something invisible and falls silent. Further away, across several blocks, two men are talking on a doorstep. Their voices carry in the still air. You can hear the cadence, the rhythm of conversation, but not the words. One of them laughs at something. The sound travels a little way through the night and fades. Somewhere a baby is crying, a thin and unhappy sound, and then a woman's voice, low and soothing, and then quiet. A church bell, several streets away, counts 9 strokes and falls silent again. This is Philadelphia going to sleep. This is the world that continued ordinary and unhurried while history happened quietly in one building on Chestnut Street. 30,000 people worrying about flour prices and summer fevers and letters that hadn't arrived. Putting their children to bed on cool floors, sitting in the dark, too warm to sleep, listening to the sounds of the city settling into night. And inside one building, 56 men, preparing to do something that would change every one of them and every one of us forever. Let your breath slow now. feel the summer warmth around you, not the sharp heat of midday, but the soft, residual warmth that stays in old stone after the sun has gone down. The kind of warmth that asks nothing of you, the kind that simply holds you gently and lets you rest. There is a building that still stands today in the heart of Philadelphia that they call Independence Hall. It is beautiful now, red brick, white trim, a stately tower, tourists moving through its rooms in quiet groups, reading the small printed cards that explain what happened here. The floors are dark and polished. The windows are clean. The air inside is cool and still, carefully controlled, the temperature held steady to protect what the building represents. But in July of 1776, it was not a monument. It was simply the Pennsylvania State House, a working government building somewhat overheated, rather overcrowded, and plagued that particular summer by a truly remarkable number of flies. The flies came from a stable on the street nearby, a livery stable where horses stood through the warm days and where the smells and the insects, produced by many horses in a small space, drifted steadily on whatever breeze existed toward the open windows of the State House. The delegates had tried keeping the windows closed, but the assembly room, where Congress met, a handsome space of perhaps 40 feet by 40 feet, with tall windows on two sides and a high ceiling, became, with the windows shut and men inside it, almost immediately suffocating. So the windows stayed open, and the flies came in. Now let us look more carefully at the men in this room, because to understand the discomfort they were enduring, you need to understand what they were wearing. The delegates to the Continental Congress were men of standing, lawyers, landowners, merchants, physicians. Men of that class dressed according to strict conventions that had almost nothing to do with physical comfort and everything to do with social position. In July of 1776, on the hottest days of the year, those conventions required the following. First, a linen shirt. This was the one concession to the heat. Linen, at least, breathes a little. The shirt had a high collar and full sleeves gathered at the wrist. Over the shirt came a waistcoat, what we might call a vest, typically made of wool or silk, fitted close to the body, buttoned from the waist to the throat. In summer, a lighter fabric might be used, but it was still an additional layer covering the entire torso. Over the waistcoat came the coat itself, a long, fitted garment reaching to the knee, with wide cuffs and full skirts at the back. In the summer of 1776, some delegates wore coats of lighter wool, but wool was still wool. It did not breathe. It held heat. It collected sweat. Below the waist, knee breeches, fitted and fastened just below the knee. And then stockings, long woolen stockings pulled up over the calf and held with a garter. And then shoes with buckles, the leather close around the foot. On their heads, when not indoors, wigs or powdered hair. Some delegates had abandoned the fashion for wigs by 1776, but many had not. A wig in July heat is its own particular form of suffering. These men were not careless of their discomfort. They simply had no alternative. To appear in the assembly room in shirt sleeves would have been not merely informal, but genuinely scandalous, an indication that a man did not take his responsibilities seriously, that he could not be trusted with the dignity of public life. And so they sat in their wool coats, in a room warmed by July and by the bodies of 56 men, and they argued about the future of a nation, and they swatted flies. Let us look at the room itself. The assembly room was lit during the daytime sessions by the natural light coming through those tall windows. But as evening arrived, and the delegates sometimes sat very late, unwilling to leave a debate unfinished, the room was lit by candles. Not the clean, steady light of the candles you might imagine. Candles in 1776 were made primarily of tallow, rendered animal fat, and they burned with a slightly wavering yellowish flame that produced both light and a faint but persistent smell. Enough candles to illuminate a room of that size meant enough candles to raise the temperature noticeably and to fill the air with a warm, slightly fatty smell that mingled with the smell of the men themselves and the smell of the horses drifting in through the windows. The light the candles produced was soft and directional. It illuminated whatever was close to it and left the corners of the room in shadow. A man reading a document in candlelight had to hold it at a particular angle, had to sometimes shift his position to catch the light properly. The letters on the page were smaller than what we are used to. Printing and handwriting both tended toward the fine and precise, and after hours in that light, eyes grew tired in a way that no amount of will could entirely overcome. And then there was the matter of writing. The delegates who were taking notes, making corrections to documents, drafting responses, were doing so with quill pens. A quill pen is a feather, typically taken from the wing of a goose, though swan and turkey feathers were also used, from which all the barbs on the lower portion have been stripped away, leaving a clean shaft, the tip of which has been cut and shaped with a small knife into a writing point. The point was hollow, and when dipped into ink, it drew a small quantity of liquid up into the hollow of the shaft by capillary action, the same process by which a thin tube draws water upward when you dip it in a glass. That reservoir of ink, modest as it was, allowed perhaps a line or two of writing before the pen needed to be dipped again. So the rhythm of writing with a quill was dip into the inkwell, a small ceramic or glass vessel, usually sitting in a wooden holder on the table. Draw the pen out carefully to avoid dripping. Write a line or two, dip again. The pen had to be held at a particular angle, not too steep and not too flat, and the pressure applied to it had to be controlled. Too much pressure and the split nib would spread and produce a blot. Too little and the ink would fail to flow. On a hot July day with sweating hands, this was not always easy. Ink blots were common. A blotted page might be recopied, or the blot might be scraped away with a small knife, leaving a faint roughness on the paper that the next line of writing would have to navigate. Nothing was wasted. Paper was expensive. Ink was made to last. Picture the room now, as evening comes on and the candles are lit. Long tables arranged in neat rows covered with green baize, the same green wool cloth used on gaming tables, chosen because it provided a soft surface that prevented papers from slipping and ink from spreading. On each table, inkwells, extra quills, blotting sand, fine sand sprinkled over fresh ink to absorb the excess and speed the drying, and stacks of paper, some blank, some covered in writing. The men behind those tables are tired. They have been meeting, arguing, discussing, and deciding for weeks. Their faces are familiar to one another in the way that only shared confinement can make faces familiar. every habit noticed, every expression anticipated, every voice instantly recognizable. Some of them lean back in their chairs with their arms folded. Some lean forward over their papers. Some look at the ceiling with the expression of men who are composing a thought that isn't quite ready yet. And underneath the debate, underneath the scratch of quills and the rustle of papers, underneath the occasional cough or the sound of a chair shifting on the wooden floor, there is the low, persistent, maddening hum of flies. It is a remarkable thing to consider. The document we carry in our national memory is the foundation of everything, the words that speak of self-evident truths, of equality, of the unalienable rights of all people. Those words were being argued over and refined and agreed upon in a room where grown men in wool coats kept pausing to swat flies off their stockings. History, it turns out, is never quite as dignified as the paintings suggest. History happens in real rooms, with real smells, and real discomfort, and real human beings who are too warm and would very much like a cold drink of water and perhaps an hour of quiet. And yet, they stayed, and they argued, and they wrote. Let yourself sink a little deeper now. Notice how still the air is around you, how cool, how quiet. The scratch of a quill on paper, faint, rhythmic, steady. The sound of thought becoming permanent. The sound of words finding their final form. Outside, the warm evening continues. The lanterns flicker. The city settles into night. And inside this room, a document slowly takes its final shape. He was 33 years old. That is the first thing to understand about Thomas Jefferson on the 4th of July, 1776. He was not yet the man on the nickel, the statue in the memorial, the name carved above the law school entrance. He was a young man, by any measure a very young man, far from home in a rented room, under considerable pressure, carrying an assignment he had not asked for and was not sure he had handled well. He was renting lodgings on the southwest corner of 7th and Market Streets, in the house of a bricklayer named Jacob Graff. The house was new. Graff had built it just the year before, and it was among the better lodgings available in Philadelphia for a man of Jefferson's means. The room was on the second floor, with 2 windows that looked out over the corner of the street. The room itself was not large. A bed, a chair, a table, a fireplace that would have been useful in any other season, but which served in July mainly as a source of additional heat that no one wanted. The floorboards were wooden, wide-planked, the kind that shift and settle and produce sounds of their own in the night when the temperature changes. And on the table, or perhaps on his lap, or perhaps moved back and forth between the two as the light shifted through the day, Jefferson's writing box. The writing box deserves a moment of attention because it tells you something important about the man who made it. Jefferson had designed it himself. He had an extraordinary mind for design. He spent decades designing and redesigning Monticello, his home in Virginia, incorporating ideas he found in architectural books from France and England and Italy, adapting them to his particular vision of what a house should be. He had the same restless, precise relationship with every object in his life. If something could be better designed, he wanted to understand how. The writing box was a simple idea executed with precision. A box roughly the size of a modern laptop made of mahogany. The top opened up and could be propped at a writing angle, forming a slanted surface. Inside, a small drawer for paper and pens, a shallow well for an inkwell, everything necessary for writing, contained in a thing that could be carried under one arm and set up anywhere. Jefferson used this box for the rest of his life. He eventually left it to a grandson, who donated it to the Smithsonian Institution, where it can still be seen today. The mahogany is dark, with age, polished by decades of handling. The hinge that props the lid has been repaired more than once. It is not a grand object. It is a practical one. That was, in many ways, the point. Jefferson's daily routine in Philadelphia that summer was shaped around the limitations of the heat and the light. He rose early. Like most people of his era, he woke near sunrise when the air was still relatively cool and the light made indoor work possible without candles. He took his meals at the lodging house or at one of the taverns nearby, where the delegates gathered to eat and to continue, over food and drink, the conversations that the formal sessions of Congress had begun. He walked. He was a great walker throughout his life, and Philadelphia in 1776, despite its heat and its smells, offered the pleasure of streets and the quiet of early morning before the city was fully awake. He observed things. He had the naturalist's habit of attention, a plant growing through a crack in a wall, the precise behavior of water in the gutter after rain, the way a particular building had been constructed and whether the proportions seemed right to him. And he wrote, constantly, compulsively, in the way that some people think aloud. Jefferson wrote letters home to Virginia, notes on what he had observed, drafts and revisions and copies of things that needed to exist in multiple versions. The Declaration was not, for him, an isolated act of inspiration. It was the most consequential piece of writing in a life that was, from beginning to end, made of writing. Now, picture the room in the evening light. The day's heat is beginning to ease very slightly. The windows are open. A faint movement of air comes through them occasionally, not quite a breeze, but the suggestion of one, enough to make the candle flame waver and lean. The flame recovers itself, steadies, burns on. Jefferson sits at his table. The writing box is open in front of him, the lid propped at its writing angle. An inkwell sits in its small depression. Beside it, 3 or 4 quills already prepared, the nibs cut, the shafts stripped of their lower barbs, ready to be picked up and used. He picks one up, dips it, shakes the excess very slightly from the tip, not enough to waste ink, just enough to prevent a blot at the start of the stroke. Then the pen touches the paper and begins to move. Jefferson's handwriting was distinctive. He wrote in a clear, slanted, very even hand, practiced and controlled, neither showy nor difficult to read. The letters were consistent in size. The lines stayed level across the page without the need for ruled guides. This was the handwriting of a man who had been writing since childhood and who had never stopped thinking about the physical act of putting words on paper as something that should be done well, done clearly, done with the same care he brought to everything else. When he made corrections, and he made many, he crossed out the words with a careful horizontal stroke and wrote the replacement above or below. Sometimes he wrote a note in the margin, a reminder to himself or a question about whether a particular phrase was exactly right. The drafts of the Declaration that survive in his handwriting show a document in motion. Words tried and reconsidered, phrases shifted and refined. The whole thing alive with the evidence of a thinking mind working towards something it couldn't quite yet see clearly. These were not ordinary words he was writing. He knew that, even at 33. He understood, in the particular way that an intelligent person in an extraordinary moment understands, that what he was setting down on paper might be read for a very long time. He also understood that if things went wrong, if the British prevailed, if the rebellion was crushed, those words would be the evidence that sent him to his death. The men who signed the declaration were signing a death warrant. If they lost, they knew it. Jefferson knew it, and yet he kept writing. What most people do not know is that what Jefferson wrote and what Congress approved were not the same document. The delegates spent days reading Jefferson's draft aloud, line by line, arguing over words, removing passages, changing phrases. 86 changes were made in total. They cut roughly a quarter of everything he had written, whole sections, paragraphs Jefferson had labored over, sentences he believed were essential. Jefferson sat through this in silence, or something close to silence. Benjamin Franklin sat beside him during at least some of the editing sessions, and Jefferson later recalled that Franklin had told him a story, a gentle, humorous story, the kind Franklin was famous for, apparently intended to help Jefferson bear the experience of watching his words be changed by a committee. The story was about a hat maker whose sign had been reduced word by well-meaning friends until nothing was left but a picture of the hat. Jefferson did not find this entirely consoling. He kept his original draft. He kept his own copy of the changes that had been made, marked carefully in the margins, so that anyone who wanted to know what he had intended could see it. He wanted posterity to judge. One of the passages removed was a long and angry attack on the slave trade, a passage in which Jefferson blamed King George for imposing the institution of slavery on the colonies. It was, even to his contemporaries, an argument that strained credibility. Jefferson was himself a slaveholder, as were many of the delegates who sat listening to his words. The passage was removed without much debate. Jefferson never forgave that particular edit. He noted it in his papers with the particular cold precision of a man making a record of an injustice he intends to preserve. The document that survived was not exactly the one he had imagined, but it was the one the world received. And in that sense it belonged, as all finished things belong, as much to the people who shaped it as to the person who began it. He was also, it should be said, homesick. Virginia was 6 days' ride away. His wife Martha was there, and she had been unwell. She was often unwell, and Jefferson worried about her with an anxiety that his letters home, careful and controlled as they usually were, could not entirely conceal. His children were there. His home, the beginning of Monticello, which he was perpetually designing and redesigning and building and rebuilding on its little mountain outside Charlottesville, was there, going about the business of existing without him. He had written to friends in Virginia with a particular kind of yearning that summer, the yearning of a man who would rather be in his garden, arguing about the best placement for a window or the correct Latin name for a plant growing along his fence line, than sitting in this warm room in Philadelphia arguing about the fate of nations. He would be home soon, but not yet. Let your eyes rest behind their lids now. Picture only the candle, small, steady, warm, the way the light holds everything near it in a soft, golden circle, and lets the edges of the room fall away into comfortable shadow. The flame bends once as a breath of air moves through the window, then straightens again and burns on. There is nothing you need to do in this moment, nothing to decide, nothing to solve, only rest. Across the room, the wax has melted a little further down the candle. A small pool of it gathers warm and clear at the base of the flame. A single drop runs slowly down the side of the candle and stops. The night deepens around the building, around the city, and the young man at the desk, in the quiet room, in the warm summer dark, keeps writing. Somewhere in Philadelphia, on the night of July the 4th, a man named John Dunlap was working. Most of the city was asleep. The taverns had closed, or nearly. The streets were quiet. The oil in the street lanterns was running low, but in a print shop on Chestnut Street, the lights were burning and a young man was standing at his equipment reading a handwritten manuscript and preparing to begin. Dunlap was 29 years old and had been working as a printer since he was a boy. He had come from Ireland as a 10-year-old apprentice, brought over by an uncle who had already established himself in the Philadelphia printing trade. He had learned the craft from the bottom, sweeping the shop floor, cleaning the type, learning to mix ink, watching and assisting as the older men set pages and ran the press. By 1776, he was the owner of his own establishment, the publisher of a newspaper, and one of the better regarded printers in the city. The Continental Congress trusted him. That is what mattered tonight. When the approved text of the Declaration needed to go from manuscript to print, quickly, quietly, before morning, they sent it to Dunlap. To understand what Dunlap did that night, it helps to understand how an 18th century printing press actually worked. Because it was nothing like the printers you have ever seen. It was a mechanical process, yes, but it was also a deeply physical, deeply manual, deeply skilled kind of work. It began with the type. Printing type in 1776 was made of a metal alloy, mostly lead, with small amounts of tin and antimony to make it harder and give it a cleaner edge. Each piece of type was a small rectangular block, roughly the size of the tip of your finger, with a single letter or punctuation mark raised in mirror image on one end. Every letter of every word had to exist as an individual physical object, made by hand, stored in a large wooden case divided into compartments. The compositor, who was sometimes the printer and sometimes a specialized worker, stood before this case and read the manuscript, one line at a time, picking up individual letters with one hand and setting them into a metal hand tool called a composing stick held in the other. The letters went in backwards, mirror image, because when the type was eventually inked and pressed against paper, the impression would be reversed, and only then would the letters read correctly. This required the compositor to read and think in mirror image. It was a skill that took years to develop, and that became so ingrained that experienced compositors could set type at remarkable speed, their hands moving from case to stick with barely a pause, the letters accumulating into words and words into lines with a rhythm as automatic as breathing. When a full line of type was set, it was transferred from the composing stick into a larger metal frame called a chase, where it was locked into place with wooden wedges. Line by line, the page was built up. Spaces between words were created by thin metal blanks, not letters, but fillers, inserted to push the type apart. Wider spacing could be achieved with thicker blanks. It was all a matter of judgment and feel. The smell of the type room was particular, metal, slightly oily from the handling, and underneath that the sharp mineral smell of the ink that had dried in the shallow grooves of previous jobs, never entirely cleaned away, accumulating in layers that told the history of every page the press had produced. And then came the ink. Printing ink of that era was nothing like modern ink. It was a thick, viscous substance, closer to a paste than a liquid, made from linseed oil that had been cooked and thickened until it was almost black, then combined with a lampblack, a fine carbon powder produced by burning oil. The result was an ink that smelled strongly of cooked oil and carbon, that clung to whatever it touched, and that dried on paper through a process of oxidation rather than evaporation. It didn't soak in or evaporate away, but instead slowly hardened through chemical reaction with the air. The ink was applied to the type with ink balls, round leather pads stuffed with wool about the size of a fist, with handles. The printer would dab the ink balls against an ink plate to pick up an even coating, then press them firmly against the face of the type, rolling them slightly to ensure full, even coverage. Too much ink, and the printed letters would be blotchy and spread. Too little, and the impression would be faint. Getting it right was a matter of experience and attention, and Dunlap had both. The press itself was a heavy, solid machine, built largely from wood with iron components at the critical stress points. It stood nearly as tall as a man. The type, now fully set and inked, was placed on a flat bed. A sheet of paper, dampened slightly beforehand because damp paper received an impression more cleanly than dry, was laid over it and held in place by a hinged frame. The whole assembly was rolled under the platen, a heavy, flat plate above the bed, and then the pressman pulled a long iron bar, which through a system of levers brought the platen down hard against the paper and type. The impression lasted only a second. The bar was pushed back, the platen lifted, the frame was folded back, the paper removed, and there was the printed page, wet, slightly fragrant with the smell of fresh ink. The letters raised slightly against the surface of the paper, visible as much by touch as by sight if you ran a finger across them. Then the paper was set aside to dry, and the whole process began again. Dunlap worked through the night, pulling copies one by one from the press. The rhythm of it was meditative in the way that repetitive, skilled physical work becomes meditative. The same motions repeated in the same order, the press responding predictably to a practiced hand, the pile of finished sheets growing slowly beside the machine. The sound was a steady combination of the creak of the press, the slap of the ink balls against the type, and the soft, decisive thud of the platen coming down. By morning he had printed somewhere between 100 and 200 copies. 26 of those broadside prints are known to survive today. Each one is worth millions of dollars. Each one carries in its ink the exact impression that Dunlap's type made against paper in the early hours of July the 5th. To do his work, Dunlap had needed the manuscript, the final approved text, handwritten, delivered to him from the State House, brought through the warm evening streets by someone whose name we do not know. Imagine holding it, a sheet or two of paper, handwriting across both sides perhaps, corrections and notations in the margins, the ink still relatively fresh. The words that would become the founding document of a nation existing in this one handwritten form, carried through a summer night in someone's hands. Dunlap worked from it through the night, set each line, checked his work, ran the press, and then, somewhere in the hours and days that followed, that manuscript vanished. We do not know what happened to it. We do not know who held it last. We do not know if it was kept carefully and then lost in some later upheaval, or if it was treated as simply a working document that had served its purpose, discarded without ceremony the way working documents often are. It exists in no archive. It sits behind no sheet of museum glass. It is simply gone, somewhere in the past. History is not all preserved and labelled and filed in neat order. History is mostly lost, mostly swallowed by time and fire and the ordinary carelessness of people who did not know yet that what they were handling would matter. What remains is not the record of everything that happened. It is only the handful of things that someone, somewhere, thought to keep. In the print shop, the press moves steadily through the dark. The platen comes down, the paper lifts, the ink dries, the rhythm of it steady and slow and purposeful, like breathing, like your breath, right now, in and out, slow and easy and complete. Dunlap is still working. The finished sheets are stacked beside the press, drying in the warm air. The ink smell fills the room. Somewhere across the sleeping city, a watchman calls the hour in a voice that travels a little way down the empty street and then fades. John Adams was certain about one thing. He was certain that the 2nd of July, 1776, would be remembered forever. He wrote as much to his wife Abigail in a letter composed in the days immediately following the vote, a letter full of conviction and the particular brightness of a man who believes he is standing at the hinge of history, watching it swing open in front of him. Before we follow that letter on its journey, it is worth pausing for a moment on John Adams himself, because he is a figure who tends to be overshadowed in the popular memory of 1776 by the more luminous presences of Jefferson and Franklin, and that is in almost every way unfair. Adams was 40 years old in 1776. He was a lawyer from Massachusetts, short and stocky, and somewhat vain about his appearance, with a brilliant and restless mind that he often could not stop from expressing even when discretion would have served him better. He was argumentative, impatient, and intensely principled, a combination that made him both indispensable to the cause of independence and frequently exhausting to work with. He was also one of the most important people in the room that summer. It was Adams who had argued most forcefully for independence when the argument was not yet won. It was Adams who had persuaded, cajoled, and occasionally bludgeoned reluctant delegates toward the vote that happened on July the 2nd. Jefferson was the writer of the Declaration. Adams was, in many ways, the person who made it happen. The relationship between Adams and Jefferson was one of the more remarkable in American history. They admired each other and irritated each other in roughly equal measure. They disagreed on fundamental questions of how the new nation should be governed. They were rivals in some periods in ways that produced genuine bitterness between them. And yet, at the end of their long lives, they reconciled and wrote to each other with a warmth and an intellectual richness that their correspondence, still read today, carries on every page. They died on the same day, the 4th of July, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Declaration was approved. But in July of 1776, they were simply colleagues, tired, hot, uncertain of what would come next, and very glad that the vote was finally done. The 2nd of July was when the Continental Congress had voted formally and officially to declare independence from Great Britain. 12 colonies in favour, 1 abstaining, none opposed. That was when independence became technically real. Adams believed that the 2nd of July would be celebrated every year from that time forward as the great anniversary of American freedom. He wrote that it ought to be commemorated with parades and bells and bonfires and illuminations, that it would be celebrated, he felt sure, by generations yet unborn. He was right about the celebration. He was wrong about the date. 2 days later, Congress finished revising and approved the wording of the Declaration itself. That happened on the 4th. And through some combination of the printing, the distribution, the way Dunlap's broadsides travelled and were received and read aloud in town squares, it was the 4th that the world remembered. Adams spent the rest of his life mildly baffled by this. He was never quite sure how it had happened. Now, let us follow his letter. The letter Adams wrote to Abigail describing the events of those days was not delivered instantly. Nothing was delivered instantly in 1776. A letter travelled by post rider, a man on horseback, carrying a leather saddlebag full of correspondence, moving from town to town along established postal roads. The postal service of colonial America was a genuine achievement, and Benjamin Franklin, who had served as Postmaster General before the Revolution, interrupted everything, had worked hard to make it reliable. Letters moved faster than most people expected. A letter from Philadelphia to Boston under reasonable conditions might arrive in 5 or 6 days. A letter to Virginia might take a similar amount of time, depending on the roads and the weather and whether the rider encountered any of the many small obstacles that 18th century travel routinely produced. The letter itself was not sealed in an envelope. Envelopes did not exist yet in the modern sense. A letter was written on a sheet of paper, which was then folded carefully, sometimes multiple times, and sealed with a small blob of wax pressed with a seal, the address written on the outside of the folded package. The wax served as both seal and lock. If a letter arrived with broken wax, the recipient knew it had been opened. Abigail Adams was in Braintree, Massachusetts, managing the family farm, raising their children, and waiting for news. She was 31 years old and by any measure one of the more formidable people in the story, intelligent, well-read, deeply engaged in the political questions of the day, and possessed of a gift for correspondence that made her letters among the most extraordinary documents produced in that era. She and Adams wrote to each other constantly through the years he spent in Philadelphia. The letters were their only contact. He could not visit, she could not come to him, and so everything passed between them in ink on folded paper, sealed with wax, carried in a saddlebag through the summer countryside. There was something both extraordinary and ordinary about that. Extraordinary because of what they were discussing, the birth of a nation, the risks they were taking, the uncertainty of everything. Ordinary because this was simply what people did. This was how you maintained a relationship across distance. You wrote, you waited, you wrote again. Think of how long news took to reach the farthest corners of the colonies, Philadelphia to Boston, perhaps 5 or 6 days. Philadelphia to Charleston, South Carolina, 2 weeks or more. Philadelphia to a farm in the western mountains of any colony, unpredictable, depending on whether a rider was going that way at all, and so the news of independence spread outward from Philadelphia in slow, uneven waves. A rider reaching one town, a newspaper carrying the story to the next, someone reading it aloud in a tavern to the men who couldn't read, a copy sent further on, passed hand to hand until the paper was soft with handling and the ink was faint. By the time the last American learned that they were now citizens of a new nation, weeks had passed. The summer was well advanced, and in Philadelphia already, the next crisis had arrived. Let your thoughts grow quieter now. There is no argument left to settle, no date to confirm, no letter to write. Only the warm night, only your breath, only rest. Adams has finished his letter. He folds it carefully along the creases, tucks the edges, melts a small piece of sealing wax over a candle flame, and lets it fall onto the fold. He presses his seal into the warm wax and holds it for a moment, then lifts it away. The impression is clean and clear. In the morning he will hand the letter to a rider, and then it will travel north through the summer countryside, through the towns and the farmland and the forests, toward Abigail and toward home, and the moment will begin to pass into memory. The document that survives, the one you can look at today in Washington, D.C., inside the National Archives building on Constitution Avenue, is not a young document. It is 250 years old. It has been present for every year of American history. It was present before the country it represents had fought a single battle, and it is present now on the other side of everything that came after. It begins with parchment. Parchment is not paper. Paper is made from plant fibers, wood pulp, cotton, linen rag, processed into a flat sheet. Parchment is made from animal skin, traditionally the skin of a calf, though sheepskin was also common. The process of making it was long and careful and had been essentially unchanged for centuries. First, the skin was soaked in a bath of lime, calcium hydroxide, for several days, which loosened the hair and began to break down the outer layers. Then the hair was scraped away and the skin was stretched on a wooden frame while still wet, pulled tight and held under tension as it dried. The tension was crucial. It was what gave parchment its characteristic flatness and smoothness, its ability to accept ink without spreading or bleeding. As it dried under tension, the fibers of the skin realigned into a surface finer than almost any paper, slightly translucent in good light, almost glowing when held up to a candle flame. The finished sheet was scraped smooth with a curved blade, any remaining roughness removed. Then it was cut to size and prepared for writing. A good piece of parchment felt smooth under the fingertip, slightly cool, with a faint resistance. Not quite like paper, not quite like anything else. People who work with historical documents describe the feeling of old parchment as unmistakable. You always know what you are holding. And then the ink. The Declaration of Independence was written in iron gall ink, the standard writing ink of Europe and the colonies for most of the previous 1,000 years. It was not a simple substance. Making it required several ingredients, and the quality of the result depended on the care with which they were combined. The primary ingredient was oak galls, small, round growths that form on oak trees when certain wasps lay their eggs under the bark. The tree responds to the intrusion by growing a protective structure around the larva, and that structure, the gall, is rich in tannic acid. The galls were collected, dried, and then crushed or ground into a powder. To that powder was added ferrous sulfate, iron sulfate, sometimes called green vitriol or copperas, a crystalline mineral that could be obtained from mines or purchased from apothecaries. When the tannic acid from the galls combined with the iron sulfate in water, a chemical reaction occurred that produced a dark compound, iron tannate, that became the heart of the ink. The mixture was thinned with water and often with wine or vinegar. Gum arabic, a natural resin from acacia trees, was added to help the ink flow smoothly from the pen and adhere properly to the writing surface. The result was a liquid that, when freshly made, was a dark grey or greenish black. As it dried on the page, further oxidation turned it black. And over the following decades, as the iron compounds in the ink continued to react slowly with air and moisture, that black gradually shifted toward the warm brown colour that we associate with old documents. Iron gall ink was remarkably durable in one sense. Documents written with it have survived for centuries in conditions that would have destroyed most other inks. But it carried a flaw. The same acidity that made it adhere so well to parchment also slowly attacked the parchment itself. Over time, the ink began to eat into the surface it was written on, a process called ink corrosion, which, if unchecked, eventually causes the ink to eat through the parchment entirely, leaving holes where words once were. This is why the Declaration of Independence has been so carefully preserved, and why the task of preserving it has become more and more sophisticated over the 2.5 centuries since it was written. The document has not had an easy life. It travelled during the Revolutionary War, moved from city to city as the British Army advanced. It spent years stored in conditions that modern archivists would consider appalling, rolled or folded, exposed to light and humidity, handled by many hands. In the early 19th century, a copy was made by pressing the original against a damp sheet, a technique that transferred ink to the copy, but also pulled ink away from the original, contributing to the fading that was already underway. It was displayed for decades in the State Department and later in the Library of Congress, exposed to natural light in ways that caused further deterioration. By the time it arrived at the National Archives in 1952, the text had faded substantially from what it had been when Dunlop's typesetters worked from a fresh copy of it. Today it rests in a sealed case, a titanium and aluminum enclosure filled with humidified argon gas, which slows oxidation and keeps the parchment at a stable humidity. The case is bulletproof and blast resistant. At night it is lowered on a hydraulic lift into a vault beneath the building, a vault whose doors weigh many tons and which are designed to survive almost any conceivable disaster. They are doing everything they can to hold the words in place. And still, very slowly, the ink continues its work. There is something profound and peaceful in that, if you let it settle over you. The people who wrote those words are long gone. Jefferson at his mahogany writing box, 33 years old, candlelight on the papers, gone. Adams sealing his letter to Abigail, certain about the wrong date, gone. The delegates in their wool coats, swatting flies in the July heat, arguing over every word, gone. Dunlap at his press, ink on his hands, the finished sheets drying beside him. Gone. The cart horse that knew the way home, the watchman who called the hour, the children sleeping in the houses along Chestnut Street, unaware of what was happening nearby. Gone. All of them. Only the document remains, fading slowly, kept carefully, outlasting everyone who ever touched it. Let your breathing slow now. There is nothing left to know tonight. The candles in the State House have burned down to stubs. The delegates have gone to their rented rooms and their boarding house beds. The flies have settled somewhere in the warm dark. The press in Dunlap's shop has stopped. The last copy has been pulled and set aside to dry. Philadelphia in the small hours of the morning is very still. The lanterns along the streets burn lower, their oil nearly spent. The horses stand quiet in their stalls. The river moves, the stars are out. And now, the city has fallen silent. The presses have stopped. The candles burn low, the signatures are waiting for morning. Somewhere above the rooftops of Philadelphia, the stars are turning slowly through the summer dark. You have walked through this night alongside the people who made it. You have felt the July warmth on the old cobblestones. You have heard the scratch of the quill. You have smelled the ink. And now it is time for the same rest that came for them. Let your breath go. Let the night hold you. The city is sleeping. And so are you.